Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Pamela Schaff, and I'm the director of the HEAL program. And I want to welcome you to today's event. I'm going to let Ted Meyer, our artist in residence, introduce our artist guest today. But just to welcome you and remind you that today's event continues the HEAL program's mission to align the work of patient artists with the core medical school curriculum and to foster enhanced understanding between patients and future health professionals. We suspect that Dr. Marcia Ciccone, who is our professional, oh, there she is, right on target. Dr. Ciccone has come from clinic. Welcome. And she's assistant professor of clinical obstetrics and gynecology and co-director of the genetics program. So I'm going to turn this over to Ted now, who will take it. Oh, okay, we're going to get her mic'd up. And thank you. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to have you here. So before I introduce our artists, I just want to say we are not breaking any HIPAA rules. This is actually her doctor, and they have agreed that she can say anything she wants. So you can.
She's always free to say whatever she wants. Yeah.
So Krista is an artist. She's had cancer twice. She's lucky enough. She's had thyroid cancer, so you made it through that, and cervical cancer, and you've made it through that. So I always start with a few facts so you guys know how prevalent all these illnesses are. So each year in the United States, about 44,000 adults get thyroid cancer. It seems to be way more women than men. And cervical cancer, 14,000 new cases a year and about 4,500 deaths. So if that's something you're interested in, sadly, you will always have patients. But here is proof that you can live through all these things. Let's start with your history. So you had developed thyroid cancer when you were 26 and dealt with that for like 10 years.
Yeah, it took a little longer than normal. Usually thyroid cancer, they kind of do the thing. They take it out, they radiate you, and then you're good to go. But for some reason, mine had already spread to a bunch of lymph nodes. So they got to hunt and peck for that for about 10 years with radiations and tumor surgeries. But it really wasn't something that it was terrifying. It was like, oh, yeah, you could live with this. They could do an autopsy on someone when they're dead and find it then. And, they were dead from other causes. So as much as it was challenging, it wasn't frightening necessarily.
So that's sort of unusual because most people we talk to who have cancer, it's such a strong word that it's terrifying to people. So,
well, to be clear, when I was 26, it was really scary. Although I was very concerned about the scar. I was like, oh, I've got to go out and buy chokers and turtlenecks now. But that's 26 for you. And it was frightening then. But it just became more of almost like diabetes. You just deal with it. It was like, all right, well, it's my annual scan. Here we go. What are you going to find? And it became refractory. Is it refractory when it didn't show up in scans? So that's.
Refractory.
Yeah.
No, it was in remission.
Well, no, it just wouldn't show up in pictures.
Oh, okay, so it was there, but biochemically.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. Yeah.
So 10 years out, they just were like, we've done all we can, and do you still have to get checked for it?
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I see an endocrinologist, but finally the markers in the blood were down to like 0, so they're like, you're good to go.
Okay.
No more treatments, no more scans.
And then August 2020, a CT scan for diverticulosis, they found this other tumor.
Yeah, so I was going about my pandemic business and had a lot of free time because I'd been laid off, which was kind of not a bad thing. I mean, it was okay. I love my job. My former supervisor's here, so I still really love that job. But I do. I still kind of work for them. But so it was pandemic time, and our family has diverticulitis. We just know it. And I was like, oh God, Mom, I got this, pain in my stomach. And she's like, you probably have diverticulitis. You really should look into that. I'm like, all right. So I called telemed because, again, this was like June or July of the pandemic, and it was a little difficult to get in to see a human. And the doctor said, I'll give you an antibiotic, but you have to go see an in-person doctor and have this scanned and checked out. Promise me that. I'm like, cool, I'll do that. So I connected with a internal medicine doctor here who ordered a CT scan. And she's like, well, I kind of calls me, just, it appears you have a tumor in your cervix. I'm like, sorry, what? That was kind of a surprise. I didn't know. Symptoms I had prior were kind of minor and nothing appeared to be wrong. So yada, 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 got a biopsy. And then I ended up in Dr. Ciccone's care, which, I got the diagnosis and was a little surprised, taken aback, because there's no family history. There was, no reason, nothing that would cause me to suspect that this was anywhere on my radar. I mean, I was looking for leukemia because that, if you have too much thyroid radiation, and I had the lifetime maximum award, I anticipated leukemia. I didn't expect this. So that was a surprise.
So how did you find our doctor friend here?
Luckily I had a Keck gynecologist who got on the horn and reached out to you. I guess you're in the same practice?
Yes, I think Dr. Mitchell, who did your biopsies initially, right?
I think it was
Or Dr.
Dr.
Almariati. Yeah. So we all work in the same practice at Verdugo Hills in the hospital up there, and I'm the only GYN oncologist up there, and so I work pretty closely with them. And so anytime they diagnose a cancer, it gets funneled to me. But I was lucky enough to meet you. Yeah. Maybe not so lucky for you, but I was lucky enough to meet you. And we got the ball rolling. Yeah. As soon as we could.
It was a weird ball.
It was a weird ball because you have a very rare type of cervical cancer.
So before we get into all that, and before we look at the art, she has a nickname for you,
Well, my friends gave it to you.
Oh, okay.
Would you like to?
Well, the doctor managed expectations. Because in one of my first appointments, it was early on, and I'd basically been told, and then I had Googled it, that I had this really rare variant, and it was like, well, there's like 20 documented cases, and about 50% of those did not end well in approximately 3 months to 2 years. And I'm like, oh, this is not good. And so I get to meet you, and you're kind of going through like, well, we don't have a real established protocol, so we're going to figure this out. And I was kind of like looking for some hope. And I think you said something like, we're going to do our best to give you good outcomes, which is all you could say, but I'm like, Goom. Luckily I had my friend there taking notes, because I think at that point I was just like, Goom, I'm out. Someone else has got to record this. So I did. I had a note taker, but yeah, I mean, you have to manage expectations to a degree. I mean, I found all the hope on my own, but it was good. You were pro.
I'm glad we got some hope.
Yeah, you did a good job.
So this is one of the things. Usually I sort of bring these things up later, but we'll talk about it before we go to the art. You have to give people a lot of bad news.
True.
And you have some advice to your future medical brethren here about how to do that compassionately.
I do think you need to be honest with people. So it is a little bit about managing expectations. You don't want people to think everything's going to be hunky-dory when you know that there's a very hard road ahead. So I am very much a believer in being honest, but also a believer in saying that people are not statistics. So people often want to know, well, how long do I have to get diagnosed with something? How long do I have? And you can give anybody statistics on, okay, well, you have stage 4 cancer of this type. The average survival is X number of months or X number of years. And if they, definitely want that information, I will tell them that. But I also tell them that with the caveat that, everybody's cancer is different. Everybody is an individual. And just because that doesn't mean that that's going to happen to you, or that's what's going to happen. And I think that's kind of the way in which I try to give people hope, is like knowing that that's not the story is not always the end. There are good things sometimes that happen, and we have to kind of hope that that's going to be the case. So I think tempering reality with hope is important.
And let me be clear, that was just the first session. I mean, beyond that, she's not. She's
Not
very
dark,
upbeat and
I
very
promise.
optimistic. She's not dark at all. Yeah, I did not. I probably would have found another doctor.
Like, I can't handle this.
Yeah, who didn't get my humor too. That was really important.
Well, we'll talk about your tumor in a little bit.
My tumor and my humor.
Let's talk about your artwork for a second.
All right.
So you do work that is obviously not about, or you did before you had cancer,
Right.
and you still do work that is not about it. But
Right.
let's talk about some of your work first. And
Sure.
and I always try to differentiate when people, internal work and external work. And you
Sure.
seem to do oceans, you do flowers, you do things that are
Yeah.
sort of outside of you, and then all of a sudden you had to start. You didn't have to, but you did start doing work about yourself. And you
Sure.
also used to be an art therapist.
Right.
So as we go through this, you can sort of talk about the desire to get your emotions out about your illness versus what you do when you are working with other patients, getting them to try to talk
Yeah.
about their illnesses.
Yes. Yes.
All right.
That's
so
a lot.
I'm just going to sort of go through a few of these non-cancer images. Do you have anything to say about these?
Well, sure. Okay, so my background is as an art educator and as an art therapist, but primarily since about 2010, I've been focusing on just my studio art career, and that's where my energy has been placed. And a lot of my work has to do with the ocean, the sea and the sky, the metaphors that come out of that. I lived in Florida prior to living in California, so 11 years in Florida, and then got almost basically the same amount here. Water, nature is always my go-to. I always go back to that. And these are cyanotypes. So this was more of a photosensitive process that I got into during the pandemic, because even in the beginning we were a little weird about even going to our studios because no one knew what was going on in 2020. So a lot of these I could do from home. And similar. Oh, and then this series, I tend to work in series. So I always go back to the ocean, and even this one has a thread of water in it. These images are taken from my grandmother's photo albums. So these are distant relatives or friends. But all of them had to do with being by the water. My grandmother also liked going to the lake and going on cruises. And so even in her childhood, she's the one in the green that appears to be biting her fingernail. So we had that thread of water throughout the generations, and that's what those are about. I think that's Great Aunt Millie on the right. But I love mixed media work.
All right. So everything we're going to see from now on, if you haven't had a chance to go down to the gallery, it's all in the gallery. Every image we're going to show.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this one, and I have a question for you about this one too.
Okay.
Talk about going from larger images to the way you did this because of your fatigue from the cancer.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, yeah. Be all over the place. So when I got treatment, can we have Dr. Ciccone talk about how they came up with the protocol? Because could we
Sure.
do that? Because
Okay.
I feel like that will say why I had such a hard time.
Okay.
Okay, so when we figured out I had this weirdo deal, and there really wasn't a consistent plan. You're like, all right, so I'm going to take you to tumor board, which I thought was really
tumor
cool.
board.
Although you don't necessarily want to go
yeah.
to tumor board because that means you're really got problems. But maybe you want to talk about how you guys figured out how to treat me,
Yeah.
and then this one is heavily affected by that treatment.
So, when there's no data in medicine, like you said, there was 20 cases documented. They're basically a case series on what people have done, but that doesn't tell you any data about what is the best thing to do, right? And I guess we should back up a little bit to what kind of cancer you actually had.
Yes.
So you guys probably know that most cervical cancer is caused by HPV. Krista's cervical cancer was not caused by HPV. It was something called gastric type cervical cancer. There's mucinous types of cervical cancer that are very rare. And then you can also imagine, when you have different histologies or different cell types, that maybe histology matters when you're talking about treatment and how it responds to chemotherapy, right? So when you look at Krista's tumor under the microscope, it actually has little signet rings that look like the cells that you have in the stomach that secrete mucin. And so because that's totally different from all of the cervical cancer that we have in the literature that we know is treatable when it's a certain size and curable with radiation and chemotherapy, the limited amount of data that we have on gastric type cervical cancer is that it doesn't respond very well to chemo and radiation. And, you know, theoretically, maybe the reason behind that is because it's a different histology, right? If it looks like a gastric cancer, maybe it behaves like a gastric cancer, and maybe it responds like a gastric cancer, and maybe you shouldn't treat it like a cervical cancer. Unfortunately, there's not enough patients and data out there to say, like I said, what you should or shouldn't do. So for the most part, it's interesting the way our service works in GYN oncology. Our patients are, on the private side, we kind of make our own decisions. At county, we typically run every patient by tumor board, which is every Monday at 7:15 in the morning. And 7 of my colleagues, including myself, go over the cases and kind of make a plan. So we go over the radiology, we go over the pathology, and the pathologists are there, the radiologists are there, the radiation oncologists are there, in addition to the GYN oncologists. And so we can discuss everything in detail, kind of put all the pieces together and put all of our knowledge together, and then come up with a plan. And so when it comes to things that there's just not a lot of data for what to make decisions on, I really appreciate having the support of my colleagues, and I think it's an important thing in medicine in general to know that you can rely on, you know, the other people in your field and getting as much knowledge as you can. And so there have been several instances looking at those case reports of what had been done before of kind of combining a cervical cancer treatment with a gastric cancer protocol. And so we ended up using traditional cisplatin, which is what's given for sensitizing or helping the tumor respond to radiation for cervical cancer normally. And we added 5-fluorouracil to that, which is more of a GI regimen to see if that would help her respond better. And so that was the first kind of thing that we tried to do. And that had been done in the past for typical variant cervical cancer. And they'd found that it didn't add a whole lot, so that had been withdrawn. But we thought maybe adding that would potentially be helpful. Again, we had no way of knowing that it was going to work or not going to work, but trying to do everything that we could to make it function. And then the second plan that we made was to do hysterectomy after radiation. So for most cervical cancer, when it's more advanced or when there's a larger tumor, radiation will cure you. It's actually quite impressive. But knowing that maybe it wasn't going to respond fully to radiation, we made a plan to remove the uterus and the cervix following chemotherapy and radiation to kind of really make sure we cleared out all of the tumor that was there. And that proved to be pretty important too, because there was still tumor there when we did surgery. So plus colon, yes. Yeah, we did a colon resection as well because there were some questionable findings, and we didn't know whether this GI thing was from the stomach or maybe it was something from the colon, and so surgery kind of helped us answer that question.
So when you go to the tumor board, which I never knew was a thing until this morning, with something so unusual, only 20 so known cases, is there excitement at the tumor board?
Usually one of us has read the articles and the rest of them hasn't, and we have to be like, here, there's this article, let me show you. But yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some degree of interest. And it's interesting because we've treated a few other patients who have come up since then with the same thing, with a similar protocol, kind of based on.
Can we get it named
precedence.
after her? Can we get a treatment?
We could. It's the Krista protocol.
No one would be able to pronounce my last name, so.
Nobody can pronounce mine either. It's okay.
So you're having your treatment, and how does this play into this
Okay,
painting?
so when you do thyroid treatment, you just get radioactive iodine, and you either isolate. They isolate you in Florida or in Missouri. They don't really care about toxic waste too much, so they just would send me home. I remember I'm like, "What? You're coming in carrying a little metal canister and a hazmat suit. You give that to me, and now I can go through the drive-in at Del Taco." And I did, and then I would go home. But in Florida, they isolate you. But again, this is like once a year, and it's one and done. And so this whole chemo thing, I didn't really know what to expect. I had been working for a charity that brought artists into hospitals, and so I got to see kids going through treatment but I did not know what to expect. So I also managed my expectations, and I prepared for the worst. I read up on every side effect I might have. I know this is what she had to deal with. Like, crazy.
It's good though. I like it. 'Cause then
crazy.
when things are better, then you're happy.
Exactly. I was pleasantly surprised. So, like, I thought there was a chance I could have neuropathy, so I needed gloves. So I got gloves. There was a chance I could lose my hair. I did not buy wigs because luckily, as Dr. Ciccone said, she gave me the protocol that did not cause me to lose my hair. I was like, thank you. All right. I mean, it got a little patchy. It was not what my stylist is like, oh yeah, you had some damage. But it wasn't, I still looked like myself. So that was a bonus. So I wasn't anticipating that. Wasn't anticipating the nausea. I wasn't anticipating the radiation treatment experience, the CT guided, which, by the way, was kind of cool. We can talk about that. And I wasn't anticipating every time I got a round of chemo, although people told me, and I did not listen, that it would become worse. The symptoms would be worse. Like the first round, I'm like, oh, I got this, take some anti-nausea meds. Baby sweet. Weed on the side, which does work. And then the next one got worse. And then by the time I came to the third round, I was just flattened. And so my brain really wasn't with me. Like I didn't even want to read a book. I was watching things I'd already watched. Like I have seen the entire Schitt's Creek series 3 times because it was comfortable and it was funny. I mean, the Harry Potter series, I don't know how many times. So I wasn't making art. I was at home and just by myself because I'm single. And I did have family and friends come and look after me while I was having a chemo weekend. But yeah, I wasn't making things. So that as an artist, you want to be creating, but I just didn't have a creative thought. And so this piece was one of the first things I made when the lights came back on in my head. And I got back to the studio and I didn't really have the energy to do a whole big painting. So I started working in grids because I was like, well, I could do a square or 2. I could do that. So I would do a square or 2. There was one piece prior to this. And then all of a sudden, a friend had given me this canvas that already had a grid pit on it. And I was like, oh, well, I could do this. And the lights came on and the ideas came. And it has a lot, it's pretty, there's some overt cancer images in there from some vintage encyclopedias, which if you're looking at like encyclopedias from the 40s, there's a lot about chemical warfare. There's a lot of war images, nuclear type things. So I had the pleasure of being able to cut them out and put them into that. And for me also, it was a way of boxing up all that I'd been through. As an art therapist, I'm very familiar with the coping skill of compartmentalization. And let me tell you, I was boxing things up during this whole process. It was like, all right, just get through it. Put it in a box, deal with that later. Put it in a box, deal with it later. And so some people think that that's not necessarily the healthiest way to do it, but I didn't want to necessarily get overwhelmed by it. So you just put it away, deal with it later. And so this was a little bit of dealing with it, getting it out, but still also moving on because I didn't necessarily want that to be my whole life. I mean, I got a lot more going on.
Did you give yourself a challenge, like as you got stronger, I'm going to do 3 more squares today than I did yesterday?
I just worked at the pace that I felt good. It wasn't that prescriptive. And as like you and I talked about, I like giving myself assignments to come up with creative ideas and just a little thing here or there. But for this, it was just like, well, I'm going to go until I get tired and then I'm done. And then I'll try again. This is a continuation of this series that brings in the cyanotypes. So this is a rather large 4 foot by 6 foot cyanotype on cloth, and I had gotten this one is a little bit more, it's titled Piecing Things Together, because again, after all of this, it was like, whoa, what just happened? What did I just do? Look at me, not dead. And so this was, I took negatives that I had from the cyanotypes and cut them up and then integrated them into a whole, which is kind of, literally my body was kind of cut up and then put back together. So that's a little bit about how I was feeling with that. Okay, so this one is overtly related to snorkeling in the Keys. I was with family down the Keys, and we took a little boat out to go snorkeling, and you jump off, and you think in the Florida Keys the water's really clear. You're like, oh, I'm jumping off into like 15 feet of water. Well, no, it was 30 feet of water, maybe 50. I don't know, but it was that clear. And so it was like terrifying. You jump in, you're like, oh God, I did like a Scooby-Doo and tried to get back up to the boat. I'm like, this is way too deep for me. And there's barracuda. Huh. But what I realized that was kind of like jumping into being sick, and looking in retrospect, I was like, oh yeah, you kind of jump off into the deep end, and then you freak out a little, and then you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe the barracuda isn't going to get me. Yeah.
So this series,
Yes.
this is the title of your Game of Life,
right?
Is your show.
Yes.
So you did a bunch of board games.
Yeah, well, my friends at the studio kept looking at my grid paintings. They're like, oh, it looks like checkerboard, or it looks like a board game. I'm like, you're right. And I started thinking about what I had been through, and it is a bit like a game. I mean, you just got to kind of play it and see how it goes. A little bit like Jumanji, but this one is called The Game of Life. And also there's a metaphysical teacher from the early 20s who wrote a book called The Game of Life and How to Play It. And it's a little bit more of my natural mindset of kind of focusing on what you do want, and just really looking towards that. And luckily I have good friends who kept pointing me in that direction throughout this. In fact, one of my good friends, when I first showed up to radiation, and I was terrified. I mean, one of the best things about my doctor is I came to her in the beginning, I'm like, because it takes a while from when you get your diagnosis to when you actually start treatment. And it feels, oh my God, interminable. Like I just was like, oh my God, I was losing my mind. I started developing panic attacks. I was hanging out with a friend watching Valley Girl, and all of a sudden I couldn't breathe. I'm sitting in there on her couch. I'm like, I can't swallow, because you know what I had done? I had researched someone who had my cancer that developed an esophageal tumor, and then she basically almost died from that. And I'm like, oh great, it's in my esophagus now, and now I can't breathe. And my friend luckily has anxiety, and she goes, I think right now you're having a panic attack, and I think you need something for that. So the next time I saw you, I was like, I am not sleeping and I'm having panic attacks. Can I have something for that? And thankfully, short-term anti-anxiety meds help you get through the figure it out phase, because it took about a month and a half before we developed a plan. So anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but
okay. So as we're going through the
Playing
board
it.
game, we talked about how it's sort of a game. You have choices to make.
Right.
You're part of that choice. You're helping her make the choices. And again, for them, what's the best way to guide people, especially in this day and age where people are looking at the internet and deciding they have esophageal cancer when they don't?
Well, I mean, I think there's kind of two parts to that, right? Yeah. So people tend to freak out about stuff like that's normal. You read the internet, and people will come to you and ask you about those things. And I think just thinking out those things logically, because sometimes there's truth to those things, and you don't want to ignore those, right? So thinking out those things logically, making sure that they're addressed, and making sure that you're thorough and that your patient feels comfortable with those things, I think is really important. And then in terms of navigating, treatment decisions and making recommendations, I think that's honestly one of the hardest parts about being a physician, especially when you're navigating something that doesn't have a very clear answer, which is what we end up doing in oncology a lot. Like sometimes, hey, there's a standard of care, this is what you do. And then a lot of times you get to a point where there's not, and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know, you have a guess of what probably could be, but you don't have a crystal ball that's going to tell you the outcome, right? And so you're asking your patient to take a leap of faith in doing those things, and to some extent you only have an answer that's so good, right? And that can be hard. It's definitely hard for the patient, and it can be hard for you too. So I think, just making sure that you're thoughtful, that you're considering your patient's wishes in terms of their life and how they want to live their life and the things that they want to do, and the things that they'd be, willing to do, and then making sure you do, thorough, of course, literature reviews of everything so that you know for yourself, well, you're constantly weighing risks and benefits in medicine. Like, what is the risk of doing this versus the benefit of doing that, and is it worth doing that thing? And so I think doing your homework, of course, as a doctor is very important. And, we don't know everything off the top of our head. We don't have everything memorized all the time. We have to go back to the literature multiple times to make sure we're thinking things through, and make sure that as a doctor you give yourself time to really like digest everything and trying to come up with the best decision or recommendation. And that can be hard, but
And that puts you back in the game. So let's talk about these.
Oh, okay. So this is another in the Game of Life series, and you see a lot of NED all over this. And in the blue circle is one that I had actually written and put on Post-its, because at a certain point, once I got through you don't really get through the fear, but when I got it managed, and feeling a little confident about life, NAD for me was no evidence of disease, and that's what I wanted to see. So I put little Post-its around my house so that when I was doing my meditation or like getting up and going to the bathroom, or it was on my bedroom mirror for really, really up until like a couple weeks ago when I put it into, actually it was longer ago, but when I took it down to put it in front of this, that's what I wanted. I just was like, we don't know the outcomes and we don't know what's going to happen. And doctors are wonderful when they kind of hedge their bets a little, because they don't know how things are going to go. It's like one of the things I held on to was to accept the diagnosis, but not the prognosis, because it figured on like 20 cases. I'm like, what kind of a data set is that? How can you figure out anything from only 20 cases? That's not enough information. And so I'm like, well, all right. So 50% of those people didn't do too hot. But there was one in there that's like still going after 10 years. I was like, it's not a bad case study. I was like, all right, let's go for that. And so when I was laying there in radiation, these are, NED was one of like the things I would hold on to. Or I had a bunch of visualizations I would use, but that was one in my kitchen, on the fridge, in the bathroom. Yeah.
Okay. Clue.
Oh, Clue. Well, first of all, I love Clue games. This is actually one from my era, since I'm a little older, from the 70s. And it was, I think when you're given a diagnosis, you look for reasons because you want to know why. And I think as physicians, you probably want to know why so it doesn't happen to somebody else. But sometimes there aren't whys. There is no Colonel Mustard with the rope and the conservatory. And for this, like I was searching. I was like, was it all the gin and tonics I was drinking at the beginning of the pandemic? Was it that? All that sugar I've eaten? Was it because I spent 4 years in the Philippines? Because evidently this is more common in Asia. I don't know. Was it because, you're going through countless. Was it because of the radiation? I mean, you're looking for reasons, but and it didn't matter. Yeah, at a certain point, you're like, this is just where you're at. This is what you got. So let's fix it. So yeah, Clue is a bit of me trying to look for reasons.
I find this work really interesting because if you guys saw the last show on Parkinson's, that was somebody just drawing his symptoms. It was a guy shaking. It was a guy having monsters come get him that were labeled Parkinson's. Whereas yours, it's definitely about your cancer, but it's not so, you wouldn't know. You could put this in a gallery and everybody go, oh, it's so nice and colorful.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so you're really coming at your illness from the side in a way artistically.
Well, and that comes from two things. Number one, when you're an art therapist, you learn how to hide messages in your artwork because you see how people process things, and it's overt. When you work as an artist, you like making stuff that people want to live with. And three, it's like I don't, as a person, like feeling bad. Like I like to feel good, and I like to focus on the good because I have what I call the slug bug theory. Like what you focus on, you see more of. Kind of like when you're driving down the road and you think of Volkswagens and then they're everywhere. But if you're not thinking about Volkswagens, you don't see them. And so a lot of times my coping mechanism is to like turn to what I want more of in my life. And that did not happen necessarily during treatment because my friends and family can tell you I was an anxious, neurotic, goth person because death was around every corner. I did not do it perfectly, but I hide my messages in my art.
And speaking of messages and clues,
Well, and this, I used to love those clue check-off things, like looking for the reasons. And when I was playing around with these pieces, I started to see like, what's a suspect? And then and I was cutting out these little bits from the vintage encyclopedias again. And what I realized is I had placed something that looked like a cure, but it was under the suspect. And then it came back to, I'm like, well, maybe sometimes the cures can also be dangerous because radiation and chemo, they're not without their side effects. So that's what that's about. Oh, this one. Okay, this one is fun. This one is titled "Playing the Hand You're Dealt," and it's a lot of times when you're going through treatment, people do the old like, "Oh, I'm sorry," the head tilt, like, "Oh, you have cancer." Oh, and I'm like. And those are the people I didn't like to tell. I kept it very private. I did not, at the beginning, I was like, I'm going to do this post, and it's going to be warrior. I'm like, no one's going to do a 5K for me. I don't want that. That's not what I want. And I kept it really private because you want to protect your energy, and you want to protect who's around you and who's going to be most supportive and uplifting to you, because you don't want people like praying sad prayers for you, like, oh, woe is Krista, she's on death's door. Even though I felt like that sometimes. I mean, 3 weeks of diarrhea from radiation, it was not a good time. But this was the hand. I mean, this is the hand I was dealt, and it didn't make sense. It was kind of like, I'm like, okay, here, you get an Uno draw 2, and then you get a couple of aces. And I had aces. I landed with, this is an amazing doctor at this teaching hospital, which I love. I mean, I wanted my doctor to, be like House, who could come in with a magic bullet, but she is not an opiate addicted sociopath. So, I mean, at least I got a fun one. I got a fun doctor, so that's good. I mean, we all have these fantasies. But this is the hand you're dealt. You got to play your cards, and you can have a really crappy hand and still win at poker, And so that's what this is. That's what this one's about.
it reminds me, when I was very sick and people always go, oh, you're very brave. And I'd be like, I'm not brave. I did not choose this to fight this. This would not have been my choice.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm like, I am not brave. You do not see me using all the negative coping mechanisms. Like, if I could have a martini every day during treatment, I would have. And that is not adaptive. But, and I did not, to be clear, because I gave my body a break.
Better insurance, you could have.
I mean, yeah. Okay, all right, so this is an older series that I had done ages ago. And this is when you're an art therapist and you think you know what you're making art about, and maybe you do and maybe you don't. And then you look at something later, you're like, oh, look at what you were dealing with. So I did a series of prescription pill bottles. And of course, people like to project their own stuff onto that, which is kind of funny. I'm like, no, I do not have a pill problem. I literally have to take thyroid medication like twice a day. And so I became obsessed with the pill bottle as an object, just like a still life. And I really studied it, and because it's something I had to touch every day and will for the rest of my life. So that's what they're beginning to be about. And again, they've got the vintage. This one, I didn't really think it was about health stuff, but after Ted and I started talking about this and what the show is, I was like, oh, look at that one. This one is titled Torschlusspanik. I don't know. It's a German word for fear of being left on the shelf, because I know in my 30s, being sick definitely impacted my decisions on having a family, which I did not eventually, but that was for different reasons. And so that's what that one is about. Oh, the survival series. Okay, so you may have heard me say I lived in the Philippines for 4 years, and that's because my father was in the Air Force, and we lived abroad, and we kept moving. When I was going through some other things in life, divorce, losing house, that sort of thing, I started working on a survival series. And in context of what I'm dealing with today, it's really helpful, because what I found is these survival manuals from the 40s, 50s, 70s, they help people get through some unthinkable things. Like, I mean, plane crashing in the middle of a jungle. How do you get out? I mean, that's it's almost like cancer. And so I did a series, and I did some writing for a book that I have still not done anything with, but I'm still here, so maybe I'll do something with it. And so these books take wisdom from survival manuals and transform them into usable things. This one was especially helpful, or something that came up later as well during treatment, because you can't really read it, but it says something along the lines of, just remember that many men and women have undergone such experiences and have come through what they did, you too can do. So that's in a 1940s teeny tiny manual that sailors and soldiers would have with them. And when I got this diagnosis, and it was really weird, I was like, okay, is this the end? Because also within my circle of friends, we'd had several within our circle die of cancer. And I'm like, oh great, I'm the next dead friend. Awesome. And I was really depressed about this and scared. I was really scared. And so I would go on a walk with one of my friends, and we would list the survivors. We would list people who went through something really horrifying and it's just fine. And they, we all had examples of people who had terrible illnesses or challenges, and they didn't die. And so we'd walk, and we'd be walking, I'm like, gold star, they didn't die. All right, next. And we would just list all of these people who did well. So that's my listing of people. Okay, this one, this is signs of land. So biblically, after the flood, they talk about seeing like little sticks floating up, and that was a sign that land was starting to appear. And so for me, like, signs of land were just like little bits of hope, little bits. Like, I finally went for a CT scan, I think prior to surgery, and I was talking with the radiation guys. I was like, hey guys, did you know that, or whatever, maybe it was a pet, I don't know. But I was like, did you know that the tumor was a little smaller? And they're like, yeah, we've been watching it. We knew, but we couldn't tell you. I was like, yes. So at least I was like, all right, it's not a total win, but I'm like, all right, we're heading in the right direction. So that was good, And you always know when your doctor is like looking a little more optimistic around you. We could joke and set, our appointments. I knew things were looking the right way.
So I have one more big question for the doctor, and then if anybody has any questions, we have about 8 minutes left here. I always ask everybody how they pick their specialty, because they have to pick their specialty. What about your specialty do you like? Why did you choose it? And what are the ups and downsides of it?
So I think I've always had an interest in OBGYN in general. There's something about women's health and the ability to connect with women on that deep level, and for some reason, when you're talking about your reproductive organs, it's a very personal thing, right? You're talking about their pregnancies and their reproductive health. It kind of lends itself to just being a very personal topic. And so I think in general, you tend to have very good relationships with your patients. You tend to have a lot of good opportunities to educate them about their bodies. And I found that very fulfilling kind of from the beginning. So OBGYN was kind of an easy choice. And then, in addition to that, there's also the whole, concept of it being interesting from like a medicine standpoint, that you still get a lot of continuity and treatment of their medical disorders. And also from a surgery standpoint, there's a lot of procedures, there's a lot of bigger surgeries that we get to do too. So it kind of combines a lot of things that people might be interested in as a doctor. And then, I chose to subspecialize in GYN oncology, which is an additional 3 years on top of your residency for specialization. Basically because I felt like I got more medicine, more continuity, more of those deep relationships with my patients in GYN oncology. And kind of one of the unique things I think about GYN oncology as opposed to medical oncology or surgical oncology is that we really get to follow our patients from the very beginning, from like diagnosis, and we're not always the ones doing the diagnosis. Sometimes it's a general gynecologist, sometimes it's something that shows up on a CT scan that somebody got. But we kind of follow them through the whole treatment planning, and then after treatment, through the follow-up too. So we get to do their chemotherapy, lead them through radiation, and then do the surgeries too. So we really know our patients, and I think that our patients appreciate that a lot. I think that having that opportunity to form that relationship is very special, and that's one of the most rewarding things I think about my subspecialty.
And the last question, we're all curious. Are you related to Madonna?
Not that I know of. I told somebody else this morning actually, I like to joke that I'm the subject of Papa Don't Preach, because that's like about the correct like timing. but I've done the genetic testing, and I'm my mom's and my dad's, so that's not true.
Does anybody have any questions?
I mean, I do want to thank Dr. Ciccone and the medical team. I mean, it is amazing to me. I was just reflecting on how much skill and talent you have to do to hold like the chemo regimen, the radiation, to be that point person, and to have the nimble surgical skills to get in there and do that too. I mean, that's a lot in one person. So, and thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have? Yes, big voice.
I'm wondering how your art has changed since being in remission. Have you?
Well, yeah, I think when you're given the go-ahead and you're like, oh, yeah, I mean, because we're going on almost 2 years. I mean, knock on wood. I mean, you don't ever, so it could be here. But it's definitely freed me up. Like, all the F's are gone. Like, I've got none left. And so, like, I'm more confident in what I'm making and realize how precious it is I get to do that.
Any other questions? Yes.
How has your perspective changed on the art that you were creating at the time, looking back on it now versus when you were creating it? Like, for example, like the pill bottle, like you said,
Oh, sure.
you look back on very different now than at the time that you were creating it.
Well, I think you see it with new eyes. I had a weird experience prior to getting my diagnosis. I made a painting that kind of creeped me out. It was an ocean painting, and it was very cloudy, and it seemed like very crossing over. I remember I was painting it, and I was like, oh, whoa, this looks like someone's heading to heaven. And it bothered me, and so I set it aside. Then 2 months later, I get this diagnosis. I was like, oh, did I intuitively know something was going on? You see it in new eyes, because your life experience has changed. Just like in any, I think, as you age, or if you get married or have children, you look back at things and just you see them with new eyes. Thank you.
This is actually a question that Ted always asks when feeling it about if Dr. Ciccone's perspective on the illness has shifted in experiencing the artwork, or how you respond to the artwork.
It's interesting, because I went to one of Krista's shows once, and I think I knew that you were an artist, but I didn't I'd never seen any of your work or anything like that. And it was really interesting, especially that one piece that you made with all the squares, and seeing all of the different intricacies that you put in there, and all of those like old clippings, and it's interesting, because we talk about stuff, but then I don't like get into like the nitty gritty of your mind and what's happening and how maybe I should,
Way
but
too much. No, that's way too much. That's a whole other specialty.
but it's interesting to see that, and to really see, it's like seeing a part of you that I didn't get to see before, and I don't know that it changes my perspective or anything, but it it's enlightening, and it's nice to kind of get that in-depth look at things.
Well, and it meant a lot to me to have her come to that show. Like, and again, as a therapist, I'm all about the HIPAA and the boundaries, very, very strict boundaries. But when I had an exhibit, it was my first exhibit post-treatment, and when I finally got my act together enough to make a show. And so I dropped off an invite at the radiation clinic and oncology, just because doctors need a win too. And I felt like, look, you helped with this. You kept me on this planet, and I'm really glad to be here. And so you need to have a win, because I know your work must be super hard, and doctors need to take care of themselves and take a win when you can get a win.
Yeah.
And it also, I think, especially in the field of oncology, I noticed doctors, when we'd work with peds, are, you can have that outside, like you can see a patient outside, and they're not going to stalk you. As you see, it felt good to be seen as a whole person. So yeah.
I just want to thank you so much, Krista, for sharing your work, your story, your perspective, and your work as a therapist and an artist and as a human being. So thank you for being with us. And Dr. Ciccone, thank you for making time and for all of your work, and Ted to making all of this possible here. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to our next event and seeing you there.